Picking up from the last video, let's now move on to male labor force participation rates. And for this, we're going to break it down by various age groups. The timeline here goes from, again, the post-World War II era to more recent periods. And there's a few trends to note. First off, notice a general decrease across all the groups. Okay? Yes, there's a little bit of a pickup here for those 65 and over in the mid-80s, but if we go back far enough, today's labor force participation of all age groups of men is lower than it was back in the post-World War II era. The most significant declines are for older males. You'll note again, those over 65 saw a significant drop after the war to the 80s. And then you'll notice that those 55 to 64 started to really drop after the 70s. A lot of this has to do with government programs, but there are also economic factors that are influential. In fact, let's take a look at these older male trend influences. The blue labels represent factors that would decrease participation and contribute to this long-run downward trend. There are, however, a couple of forces we think might be increasing participation over this time frame. Clearly, those decreasing participation are dominant. One factor is real wage growth. Over this time frame, we see real wages growing on average, and as a result, that's going to cause some older males to decrease their labor force participation. If this is true, then the income effect is dominating the substitution effect. Recall that higher real wages cause some people to work more and cause some people to work less. So only if this is true would the older male actually work less from those higher wages. Another factor is deteriorating health. As males get older, the physical ability to do work may diminish or become impossible. In our model, the way of illustrating this is the indifference curve becomes steeper. You can think back to that leisure lover steep indifference curve versus the workaholic flat indifference curve. Sometimes nature limits the extent to which people can participate in the labor market, and certainly as we get older, the likelihood of that is greater. Pensions are another factor. Now, we've had Social Security as a system since the late 1930s, so this period that we're looking at, this kind of decrease from the post-World War II era, Social Security was already in place. However, private pensions have emerged as a greater benefit for males. And what is a private pension? Well, it's where instead of the government providing you retirement money, it's your private employer providing you retirement money. Private pensions have grown in part because over time, companies have competed to attract workers not just through higher wages, but through fringe benefits. And private pensions are a very nice fringe benefit. These more lucrative pensions have led to an income effect. Recall, an income effect can occur from higher wage growth, but it can also occur from more income. Two routes to the same end. The income effect then leads to a greater desire to take leisure and therefore less work. Since Social Security was around during this period of decreased older male participation, the program itself didn't contribute to less working by older males. But there is a component of it that may have, and this is the benefit reduction rate. To make it simple, if you work while you're receiving Social Security benefits, under certain circumstances, you may have your benefits reduced. So kind of like for every dollar you earn in your job, you might get 50 cents cut from your Social Security benefit. Those are just for numbers, are just for illustration purposes. The program itself is kind of complicated and more nuanced. But what does that do to the mindset of a worker that is receiving Social Security? Well, it means their take-home pay is going down. So, in essence, they're seeing the wage come in from their job, but then they're seeing the Social Security check get smaller. So they feel like their take-home pay is being reduced by the amount of the Social Security reduction. And this creates a substitution effect. Remember, when wages go up, the substitution effect actually causes people to work more. But when wages go down, it causes them to work less. So this benefit reduction rate could have contributed to the decreased participation of older males. It's not going to be significant, though, because the benefit reduction rate only applies to people that retire before their full retirement age. So if the Social Security program says you can retire with full pension at 67, and you choose to retire earlier, as early as 62, then that period of time between 62 and 67 is a period where you would be subject to the benefit reduction rate. So if you work, you would then have your check from Social Security reduced because of the wages you're earning. However, once you get past that full retirement age, 67, you can work as much as you want. There is no benefit reduction rate. So this really would only apply to a small subset of the older male population that are in that period of early retirement. Another factor is increased labor force participation of spouses, mostly women, because in the same period of time after World War II that we see the drop in male participation, we're seeing women entering. And a lot of those women are married, part of the household, and they're bringing in income to that household, and that becomes a non-wage income effect for the males. And that causes them to work less, participate less. Disability benefits are another factor that need to be considered. These really took hold in the late 60s, early 70s period, and you'll notice that the 55 and over group really starts to drop in terms of participation, and we continue the drop for 65 and over. Disability benefits are a non-wage income effect. And notice the pattern here that we have a non-wage income effect from disability, from the working spouse, and from these pensions. In all three of these cases, what does it do? It causes these older males to work less. But disability benefits vary based on your pre-disability wage. Lower wage workers are likely to get a higher fraction of their pre-disability wages from the program, whereas higher income earners are likely to get a lower fraction. Example, if you make $30,000 a year, maybe you get $15,000 in disability. But if you make $100,000 a year, you might only get $25,000. As a result, the lower wage worker gets half their income replaced by the program, whereas the higher income worker only gets 1/4 of their income replaced. This explains why when we see decreased participation from disability benefits, it seems to be disproportionately among the lower wage, blue-collar workers. Even though all of these factors have contributed to the decreased older male participation in the labor force, some have actually increased participation, most notably these two. Formal education. We already learned that real wages have grown over time, and that has caused, up here, a decreased participation among older males. But that was because we assumed these older males had an income effect that dominated the substitution effect. If we look at older males with education, we often see the opposite effect. We see a substitution that dominates the income effect. And the explanation for this is that when somebody gets a formal education, they're more likely to be doing a job that aligns with their abilities and their interests. And so higher real wages come with a greater willingness to work more and desire to work more. It could also be that formal education creates jobs that are less physically demanding. And because of that, the ability to respond to the higher real wages through working more is greater than maybe a blue-collar worker that has a physically laborious job. Real wages go up over time, but those with laborious jobs and dangerous jobs, they respond to those higher real wages by leaving the labor force, decreasing participation. Whereas those with the formal education have more comfortable jobs, less dangerous jobs, and they respond by working more. In our model, this is illustrated by indifference curves that become flatter. Again, moving from a leisure lover to a workaholic. Finally, increased participation can come from higher labor force participation of spouses. This theory says that over time we've seen women enter the labor force as men have left. That, as we already learned, caused up here men to leave the labor force because they had a non-wage income effect. But it's actually possible that as the women go to work, the men prefer shared leisure, so they don't have as much of an incentive to stay at home. In other words, without the wife at home, the husband gets bored and goes out and gets a job. Put more technically, the non-wage income effect up here that caused a decreased participation of the older male is offset by a flatter indifference curve as the desire for leisure drops without the spouse to share it with. Okay, now let's move on to female labor force participation rates. We already learned that, for the most part, they've been increasing over the same time frame that men have been leaving. And here it breaks it down by different age groups, but we have a general increase across all age groups, and approximately 2/3 of this increase is from married women. Now, that's not illustrated in the graph, but it is an important societal factor that needs to be kept in mind, because it appears that there is some incentive to participate in the labor force for married women that isn't there for single women, and we'll extrapolate on that as we progress. But there are many influences on this increased female participation. One big one is real wage growth. We saw before that males have experienced real wage growth, but that caused a lot of them to leave the labor force, meaning an income effect dominated the substitution effect. It's believed that for women, the income effect was either small or zero, and that meant the substitution effect dominated, which means the real wage growth was causing women to work more, not less. Remember, when you're looking at the income and substitution effect, higher wages affect both, but for the income effect to actually occur, the person must be working to begin with. If you're not working and wages are going up, your income doesn't go up. You do experience the substitution effect because the cost of leisure is going up. Sitting on that couch is getting more expensive even if you don't work at all. And the belief is that because a lot of women were homemakers during right after the war, what ended up happening is they had a really strong substitution effect, but almost no income effect because higher wages didn't increase their income because they weren't working. Another factor is changing preferences and attitudes. You have a lot of movements that occurred during this time frame. In the 60s and the 70s, you saw the feminist movement, the anti-discrimination movement. You started to see more cultural acceptance of women in the workplace and in educational environments, and this caused indifference curves to become flatter and greater participation in the labor force by women. Another force was rising divorce rates. Divorces impacted women more disproportionately than they did men, because in the past, men were more likely to be the primary income earners in the household. So the increased probability of divorce incentivized a lot of women to stay connected to the labor force, keep a part-time job on the side, maybe continue their education, and so forth. This made their indifference curves flatter and kept them participating at a higher rate than before divorce rates were going up. And then also the lower non-wage income after divorce. Alimony, child support, and welfare would have lowered the income for the female household. and therefore induce them to likely participate more. That is, the income effect outweighed the substitution effect.